The pulse of gunfire echoed across the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea as Private First Class Marcus Wilson steadied his breath against the rolling deck of the USS Kidd. His Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle, modified with a uninertal scope, rested against his shoulder as he tracked the distant speck growing larger against the cloudless April sky. The date was April 11th, 1945. The destroyer had already repelled 3 aerial raids that morning while on picket station 90 miles east of Okinawa. Through his scope, Wilson could see the distinctive silhouette of a Japanese Zero fighter, its course erratic, yet determined. Unlike the others, this one wasn't turning away. Aircraft bearing 270, coming in fast and low. Wilson's voice cut through the chaos of battle stations. The 24-year-old Marine from Harlem, New York, had been temporarily assigned to the destroyer as part of an experimental sniper unit tasked with targeting kamikaze pilots. It was a desperate measure for desperate times. As the aircraft closed to within 1,000 yards, Wilson drew a deep breath, calculating the trajectory with instincts honed through months of combat. His finger tightened on the trigger. One shot, a second. The Zero kept coming, now streaming smoke, but its pilot slumped forward over the controls. The aircraft banked slightly, splashing into the sea less than 500 yards from the port side of the destroyer. Water erupted skyward as crew members cheered, but the celebration was premature. Through his scope, Wilson spotted another aircraft approaching from starboard. "Second aircraft! Starboard beam!" he shouted, pivoting his rifle. But this time, the angle was impossible, the window too narrow. No one in the 21st Destroyer Squadron knew that in the next 90 seconds, the choices of this lone black Marine would challenge every rule in naval combat doctrine and save hundreds of lives aboard the USS Kidd, even as tragedy still struck. Marcus Andrew Wilson was born on July 14, 1921, in the burgeoning community of Harlem, New York. The eldest son of James Wilson, a World War I veteran who had served with the renowned 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, and Eliza Wilson, a schoolteacher who had migrated north from Georgia. The young Marcus grew up in a household where education was paramount, but where the harsh realities of the Great Depression and racial segregation cast long shadows over his formative years. His father often recounted stories of fighting alongside French forces in the trenches of Europe, where he had earned the Croix de Guerre for bravery. "Over there," James would tell his son, "they treated us like men, like soldiers. It was coming home that hurt the most." These stories implanted in Marcus a complex relationship with patriotism, a desire to serve a country that often refused to serve him in return. By his 18th birthday, Marcus had developed into a remarkable marksman. Weekends spent hunting with his father in upstate New York had cultivated an instinctive understanding of ballistics that few could match. He could gauge wind speed by watching tall grass bend, judge distance with uncanny accuracy, and hold a rifle so steady that his high school ROTC instructor once commented that Marcus breathed between heartbeats when he fired. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Marcus was working as an apprentice machinist in a Brooklyn shipyard, one of the few industrial positions open to a young black man with his skills. The shipyard job was considered essential to the war effort, providing him with a deferment from the draft. But after watching newsreels of the destruction in Hawaii, he made a decision that surprised his parents. "I need to be where I can do the most good," he told them over dinner one evening, "and I think that's with a rifle in my hands." The United States Marine Corps had never accepted black recruits before 1942. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 established the fair employment practice that pushed the Marine Corps to begin admitting African American recruits, albeit into segregated units. When Marcus attempted to enlist in January 1943, he was initially turned away. "The Marines don't take colored men," the recruiting officer informed him bluntly. But Marcus returned the following month after the policy had changed, becoming one of the first black Marines to train at Montford Point, a segregated facility near Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The training at Montford Point was deliberately made harsher than at other Marine facilities. Drill instructors pushed the black recruits relentlessly, convinced that they would break under the pressure. But men like Marcus proved them wrong. During rifle qualification, he scored so highly that his white instructor demanded he repeat the test, suspecting cheating. Wilson did, and scored even higher. "I've never seen shooting like that," the range officer muttered, inspecting Wilson's target with narrowed eyes. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" "My father taught me, sir," Wilson replied, standing at rigid attention. "He was with the 369th in France." The officer nodded slowly. "Well, whatever he taught you, it stuck." He hesitated, then added quietly, "That's the kind of shooting we need on the front lines." But despite his exemplary performance, Wilson and his fellow black Marines were primarily assigned to ammunition and depot companies, handling supplies rather than fighting. They were intended to remain far from the front lines, but the brutal reality of the Pacific War often blurred such distinctions. After completing his training in June 1943, Wilson was assigned to the 7th Marine Ammunition Company, supporting the 1st Marine Division in the Pacific Theater. His unit first saw action during the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944. While officially designated as ammunition handlers, Wilson and his fellow Marines frequently came under fire while delivering supplies to the front. On Kwajalein Atoll, when Japanese snipers pinned down a Marine rifle company, Wilson used his hunting skills to spot and eliminate 3 enemy marksmen hidden in the dense palms. His actions caught the attention of Major Thomas Green, who began keeping an unofficial record of Wilson's sharpshooting abilities. "The man has a gift," Green wrote in his personal log. "It's a damn shame he's wasting it hauling ammunition crates when he could be saving Marines' lives." But the Marine Corps' rigid segregation policies prevented Wilson from being reassigned to sniper duties, despite increasingly desperate needs for skilled marksmen as the island-hopping campaign intensified. By late 1944, Wilson had participated in the Marianas Campaign, including the brutal fighting on Saipan and Guam. His company suffered significant casualties, not from combat duties, but from Japanese night infiltrations targeting supply dumps. During one such raid, Wilson took command after their white lieutenant was wounded, organizing a defensive perimeter that held until dawn. For this action, he received a Bronze Star, though the official citation carefully described his role as maintaining essential supply lines, rather than acknowledging his combat leadership. After Guam was secured, a chance encounter changed Wilson's trajectory in the war. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Shapley, commanding officer of the 24th Marines, observed Wilson informally instructing white Marines on marksmanship techniques. Intrigued, Shapley arranged a demonstration. Using a standard-issue Springfield rifle, Wilson hit 8 out of 10 targets at ranges exceeding 800 yards in combat conditions. Shapley, pragmatic and increasingly desperate for qualified snipers to counter the Japanese marksmen decimating his units, made an unprecedented decision. He requested Wilson's transfer to a special assignment, creating paperwork that designated him as a scout observer, attached to combat units, circumventing the regulations that prevented black Marines from serving in frontline roles. "This war is killing too many of my men for me to care about color," Shapley reportedly told a questioning staff officer. "I need shooters who can hit what they aim at, and Wilson can do that better than almost anyone I've seen." The arrangement was unofficial and precarious. Wilson would remain technically assigned to his ammunition company, but would be borrowed for special assignments. It was a compromise that reflected the contradictions of America's segregated military, recognizing Wilson's exceptional skills while maintaining the fiction of separation. Wilson's first assignment under this arrangement came during mopping-up operations on Guam. Japanese holdouts continued to harass American positions from hidden caves and dense jungle. Wilson, paired with a white spotter named Corporal David Reynolds, was tasked with locating and eliminating enemy snipers who had killed several Marines in a newly established camp. "They say you can shoot," Reynolds said when they first met, his tone neutral, but his eyes skeptical. "I can hit what I aim at," Wilson replied simply. Over the next 3 days, they accounted for 7 Japanese snipers, with Wilson making one shot at just over 700 yards, a feat that earned grudging respect from Reynolds and the other white Marines. Word of Wilson's abilities began to spread through informal networks, though official recognition remained elusive. "Never thought I'd be taking orders from a colored fella," Reynolds admitted on their 3rd night in the field. "But I've never seen anyone shoot like you." Wilson just nodded. "Out here, the only color that matters is green. We're all Marines." By February 1945, Wilson had quietly trained with several white Marine sniper units preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. Though never officially recognized as a sniper, his skills had earned reluctant respect from his white counterparts. With the Pacific War entering its bloodiest phase, the distinctions of color began to matter less than the ability to keep fellow Marines alive. That was how, by a series of unusual circumstances and unofficial arrangements, Private First Class Marcus Wilson found himself assigned to the USS Kidd as part of an experimental Marine sniper detachment tasked with targeting kamikaze pilots, an assignment that had never existed before and was born of pure desperation. His final words to his closest friend, Corporal James Hamilton, before boarding the destroyer reflected both his determination and his recognition of the historical significance of his position. "If I do my job right," Wilson said, "maybe they'll finally see that the color of a Marine has nothing to do with how well he fights." He had no idea that soon that observation would be proven in the most dramatic fashion imaginable, as the USS Kidd sailed into the maelstrom of the Okinawa campaign and the deadliest kamikaze attacks of World War II. The Battle of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, represented the final major amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Beginning on April 1, 1945, it would evolve into the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign, lasting 82 days and claiming more than 200,000 lives. The massive operation involved more than 1,500 ships, including the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Kidd, designated DD-661. Kidd had already earned a formidable reputation in the Pacific theater. Commissioned in April 1943, she had participated in operations throughout the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and the Marshall Islands. By 1945, her crew was battle-hardened and respected. Her commanding officer, Commander Harry G. Moore, had taken command in August 1944, replacing the ship's first skipper, Commander Alan Roby. The ship herself was a formidable weapon, a Fletcher-class destroyer, displacing 2,500 tons, armed with 5.5-inch guns, multiple anti-aircraft weapons, and torpedo tubes. Her crew of 320 sailors referred to themselves as the Pirates of the Pacific, an homage to the historical privateer Captain William Kidd, from whom their vessel took its name. A pirate image had even been painted on the ship's forward smokestack, though this had been ordered removed by higher authorities in late 1944 as unprofessional. By April 1945, the nature of the Pacific War had changed dramatically. As American forces pressed closer to the Japanese home islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy had largely been destroyed as an effective fighting force. But a new and terrifying weapon had emerged, the kamikaze, or divine wind. Japanese pilots, driven by a combination of fanaticism, patriotism, and desperation, deliberately crashed their aircraft into American vessels in suicide attacks that were difficult to defend against. The Navy had developed a system of defense called the radar picket line, destroyers stationed as an early warning system around the main fleet to detect incoming air attacks. These picket ships were positioned up to 70 miles away from the main fleet, forming the first line of defense. They were also the most vulnerable targets, lacking the massive anti-aircraft capabilities of larger vessels. On April 11, 1945, The USS Kidd was assigned to Radar Picket Station Number 1, approximately 90 miles east of Okinawa. With her were sister ships USS Black, USS Bullard, and USS Chauncey, forming a defensive screen. The ships had already repelled 3 coordinated air raids earlier that morning with the help of combat air patrol fighters. Wilson was one of 7 Marine snipers distributed among the picket ships, an experimental tactic born of desperation. The theory, championed by Lieutenant Commander James Finley, was simple. Expert marksmen might be able to target the pilots of incoming kamikaze aircraft at close range, either killing them or causing enough damage to divert their suicide trajectory. It was a long shot in every sense of the phrase, but the mounting losses from kamikaze attacks had driven naval commanders to try anything that might save their ships and crews. In the previous weeks, 23 Allied ships had already been sunk by kamikaze attacks, with many more damaged. The destroyer USS Bush had been sunk on April 6th, and the USS Colquhoun followed on April 6th, both victims of Japanese suicide pilots. Every man aboard the Kidd knew they were primary targets. What made the situation even more perilous was the Japanese tactic of targeting the picket ships first, hoping to blind the main fleet by destroying its early warning system. The men serving aboard these vessels called their assignment the most dangerous job in the war. Statistics would later confirm this grim assessment. Of the 36 destroyers damaged or sunk by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign, most were serving on the picket line. The men of the USS Kidd had established a grim routine by April 11th. Each morning began with a reveille at dawn, followed by battle stations as Japanese air attacks typically began shortly after first light. The crew would remain at general quarters for hours, sometimes all day, as successive waves of enemy aircraft probed their defenses. For Wilson, life aboard the Kidd presented unique challenges beyond the constant threat of attack. As the only black Marine aboard, he occupied an ambiguous position, respected for his skills, yet still separated by the invisible barriers of race. He was assigned a bunk in a small storage compartment rather than in the Marine detachment's quarters, took his meals alone or with the ship's few black sailors who served as stewards, and spent much of his free time in isolation. Yet, in the crucible of combat, these distinctions began to fade. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Bradley, the officer in charge of the Marine detachment, had initially viewed Wilson's assignment with skepticism. "I'm not sure about this experiment," he had told Wilson bluntly when the Marine first reported aboard, "but they say you're the best shot in the Pacific, so we'll give it a try." After Wilson's first successful engagement with an incoming kamikaze, striking the aircraft's cockpit at 600 yards and causing it to veer off course and miss the ship entirely, Bradley's attitude shifted. "Whatever else you are, Wilson," he acknowledged, "you're a damn fine Marine." The morning of April 11th began like many others. Radar picked up the first wave of Japanese aircraft shortly after 0600 hours. Combat air patrol fighters engaged them approximately 30 miles from the picket line, shooting down several, but a few broke through. The Kidd's 5-inch guns opened up, their deep booming punctuated by the chatter of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. Wilson, positioned on the port side of the bridge with his rifle, scanned the horizon through his scope. His assigned sector was from direct ahead to port beam, a 180-degree arc that complemented the coverage of another Marine sniper, Private Robert Jenkins, who covered the starboard side. The first attack was repelled without damage to any of the picket ships. The second came 2 hours later, with similar results. The third, around noon, was more determined. Wilson accounted for one aircraft hitting the pilot from 500 yards as the plane approached on a direct course for the Kidd's bow. The Zero cartwheeled into the sea, fragments of its fuselage skipping across the water like stones. "Good shooting, Wilson," called out Commander Moore from the bridge. "That's 3 you've gotten since you came aboard." But the day's worst was yet to come. At 1409 hours, radar operators on the Kidd observed a dogfight between American Corsair fighters and several Japanese Zeros approximately 5 miles from their position. One of the enemy planes, trailing smoke, descended to near sea level and began a direct approach toward the USS Black, positioned 1,500 yards off the Kid's starboard beam. Wilson, from his position, could see the aircraft clearly through his scope. The Zero was damaged but still under control, its pilot clearly intent on taking a destroyer with him. The Kid's guns were firing furiously, but the aircraft was presenting a minimal profile as it approached bow on to the Black. "He's going for Black," someone shouted on the bridge. Then, unexpectedly, the aircraft pulled up and banked sharply, passing directly over the Black without striking it. For a brief moment, there was confusion. Had the pilot lost his nerve? Had he been killed? Then the terrible realization dawned. He was now heading directly for the Kid's starboard side. Wilson pivoted, tracking the aircraft through his scope. At this angle, most of the Kid's guns couldn't bear on the target without risking hitting the Black. The ship's captain ordered hard left rudder, but the destroyer had barely begun to turn when Wilson fired twice in rapid succession. Through his scope, he saw the canopy of the Zero shatter and the pilot slump forward. But physics and momentum continued their inexorable course. The aircraft, now without guidance, dipped slightly but continued toward the ship. It crashed into the starboard side of the USS Kidd at 14:15 hours, striking the forward boiler room. The impact was catastrophic. The bomb carried by the Kamikaze was catapulted through the ship and detonated just seconds later, adding to the destruction. 16 sailors in the boiler room were killed instantly, scalded by superheated steam. The explosion tore a massive hole in the ship's side, flooding compartments and starting fires throughout the forward section. Wilson was thrown violently against the bridge bulkhead by the force of the explosion. Blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, he staggered to his feet as the ship listed slightly to starboard. All around him was chaos, wounded men screaming, officers shouting orders, damage control teams racing to contain the flooding and fires. The Kid was gravely wounded, but still fighting. Her remaining weapons continued firing at other Japanese aircraft, attempting to finish off the damaged destroyer. Commander Moore, blood streaming from a wound on his arm, remained on the bridge, coordinating the ship's defense while simultaneously organizing damage control efforts. For Wilson, the next moments would define not only his own fate, but potentially that of everyone still alive aboard the Kidd. As he regained his senses, he realized that the ship's primary anti-aircraft director had been damaged in the explosion. The guns were firing, but without coordinated direction, their effectiveness was severely compromised. Looking to the sky, he saw what the others had not yet noticed. 3 more kamikazes breaking through the combat air patrol, heading directly for the wounded destroyer. With the ship's defenses in disarray, they would almost certainly score additional hits, likely sending the Kidd to the bottom with all hands. What happened next was never recorded in any official after-action report. No medal was awarded, no commendation issued, but the survivors of the USS Kidd would recount it in hushed tones for decades afterward, a moment when conventional military doctrine was abandoned in favor of desperate innovation. Wilson knew that the standard Marine sniper rifle had no chance against multiple aircraft, but on the deck below the bridge sat something much more powerful, one of the ship's unattended 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, its crew either dead or wounded in the initial explosion. Without hesitation, Wilson abandoned his position and raced down the ladder to the main deck. The 40mm gun normally required a crew of 4 to operate effectively: a trainer, a pointer, a loader, and an ammunition handler. Wilson had been cross-trained on such weapons during his service with the ammunition company, but had never operated one single-handedly in combat. As he reached the weapon, he saw that its power systems were still intact. Swinging the heavy gun around manually, he aligned it with the lead kamikaze, now less than 2,000 yards out, and closing fast. The ship continued to list, making the manual aiming all the more difficult. Wilson had no fire control radar, no mechanical computing sight, just his eyes, his instincts, and his experience judging the speed and direction of moving targets. He fired a burst, tracking through the aircraft rather than leading it as doctrine dictated. The heavy shells missed, but only barely. Adjusting his aim slightly, he fired again. This time, the Japanese aircraft's wing disintegrated in a shower of metal and fuel. The Zero cartwheeled into the sea 800 yards from the ship. Without pausing, Wilson swung the gun toward the second aircraft. His first burst missed completely. The aircraft was approaching from a different angle, requiring different calculations. His second burst caught it squarely in the engine, causing it to veer away before crashing harmlessly into the ocean. The third Kamikaze, seeing the fate of its companions, attempted a different approach, coming in low and from the rear of the ship where fewer guns could target it. Wilson struggled to traverse the heavy weapon, its hydraulics damaged and responding sluggishly. For several terrible seconds it appeared he would not be able to bring the gun to bear in time. Then another figure appeared beside him, gunner's mate, second class, Robert Caldwell, his face streaked with blood from a shrapnel wound. Together the two men forced the gun around, tracking the final attacker. Their combined fire caught the aircraft when it was just 300 yards from the ship. It exploded spectacularly, debris raining down around the kid but causing no additional damage. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that, Marine?" Caldwell gasped as they slumped against the gun mount, exhausted. "Squirrel hunting in the Catskills," Wilson replied with a grim smile, though the squirrels were a lot smaller and didn't shoot back. The immediate threat had passed, but the kid's ordeal was far from over. The ship had taken a devastating hit. 38 crew members were dead, another 55 wounded. The forward boiler room was destroyed, significantly reducing the ship's speed and power. Fires continued to burn in several compartments, and flooding threatened the ship's stability. Commander Moore ordered all available hands to damage control stations. Wilson, despite his unofficial status and his own injuries, joined a firefighting team in the forward section of the ship. For hours he worked alongside the kid sailors, passing buckets, shoring up bulkheads, and helping evacuate the wounded. "Never seen a Marine work like that," muttered Chief Petty Officer William Jackson, as they struggled to contain a persistent fire near the forward magazine. "Thought you sniper types just like to keep your hands clean." Wilson wiped sweat and soot from his face. "My father always said a man does what needs doing, no matter what the job is." As the destroyer limped south to rejoin the task group, Japanese aircraft continued to harass her, though none managed to score additional hits. The kid's remaining gunners, inspired by Wilson's example, maintained a fierce defensive fire that drove off further enemy planes attempting to finish off the wounded ship. Throughout the night of April 11th, the crew of the Kid fought to keep their vessel afloat. Emergency repairs were made to damaged compartments, flooding was contained, and fires were gradually extinguished. By dawn on April 12th, it was clear that the ship would survive, though she was in no condition to continue combat operations. The next morning brought new challenges. With many of the ship's officers wounded, Wilson found himself assigned to a burial detail. 23 of the 38 men killed in the attack would be buried at sea, their bodies too badly damaged to preserve for return to the United States. The remaining 15 would be transferred to a hospital ship once the Kid reached Ulithi Atoll, their final journey home delayed but not denied. The burial ceremony was solemn and brief. Commander Moore, his arm now in a sling, read from the ship's Bible as each canvas-shrouded form, weighted with shells, slipped beneath the waves. Wilson stood at rigid attention throughout, his face impassive but his thoughts in turmoil. Among the dead was Private Robert Jenkins, the other Marine sniper who had covered the starboard side of the ship. They had barely spoken during their time aboard. Jenkins, a farm boy from Iowa, had been uncomfortable around Wilson, limiting their interaction to terse professional exchanges. Yet in death, their differences seemed trivial. Jenkins had done his duty, as had Wilson. That, in the final accounting, was what mattered. As the last body was committed to the deep, radio operators brought word of President Roosevelt's death. The news stunned the crew, many of whom had never known another commander-in-chief. For Wilson, whose father had found employment through Roosevelt's New Deal programs during the Depression, The loss felt oddly personal, as if a distant but benevolent patron had been suddenly removed. "Seems like the whole world's changing," Caldwell muttered, as they stood at the rail afterward, watching the endless expanse of the Pacific. "Wonder what'll be left when this is all over." "Something better, I hope," Wilson replied. "Has to be, after all this." For Wilson, the aftermath of the attack brought both recognition and a return to invisibility. In the chaos of battle, his actions had transcended the rigid racial barriers of 1945 America. White sailors who had never spoken to him before now nodded in respect as he helped with the wounded. Commander Moore personally thanked him for his exceptional initiative under fire. But when the ship reached Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs on April 12th, the normal segregation quickly reasserted itself. As the dead were buried at sea, a solemn ceremony that coincided with the announcement of President Roosevelt's death, Wilson found himself once again relegated to the periphery, his contribution unrecognized in official reports. The Kid remained at Ulithi for nearly 3 weeks, undergoing temporary repairs sufficient to enable her to reach a major shipyard in the United States. During this time, Wilson continued to assist with repair efforts, his skills as a machinist, honed during his civilian work in the Brooklyn shipyard, proving valuable as the crew struggled to restore damaged systems. On May 2, 1945, the USS Kidd departed Ulithi bound for Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. The journey would take more than 3 weeks, proceeding at reduced speed due to the ship's damaged propulsion systems. For Wilson, it marked a strange interlude, neither at war nor at peace, suspended between the intensity of combat and the uncertainty of what awaited him upon return to American shores. During the long crossing, Wilson found an unexpected ally in Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Sullivan, the ship's damage control officer. Sullivan, a Naval Academy graduate with an engineer's practical mind, had been impressed by Wilson's performance during the crisis and sought him out to assist with ongoing repairs. "You've got good hands and a better head," Sullivan told him bluntly. "Don't care what color either of them are. I need help keeping this bucket afloat until we reach Frisco." Over the next 3 weeks, they worked together to maintain the destroyer's fragile systems. Sullivan, discovering Wilson's background as a machinist, gave him increasingly complex tasks, treating him more as a skilled technician than a Marine rifleman or ammunition handler. "You know," Sullivan remarked one evening as they sat on the fantail, watching the sun set into the vast Pacific, "after the war, the Navy's going to need men who can think as well as fight. You ever consider staying in?" Wilson shook his head. "They don't make men like me officers, sir, and I don't want to spend 20 years passing ammunition or serving meals." Sullivan was silent for a long moment. "Things might change. This war's shaken everything up. Nothing's going to be quite the same afterward." "Maybe," Wilson conceded, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But some things change slower than others." The USS Kidd arrived at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard on May 25, 1945. As the damaged destroyer was eased into its berth, the crew could see dozens of other vessels in various states of repair, silent testimony to the ferocity of the Pacific War's final stages. The air raid sirens that had become the soundtrack of their existence were replaced by the clangor of shipyard work, the shouted orders of dock workers, the hiss of welding torches. For most of the crew, their arrival marked a welcome respite from danger, a chance to enjoy shore leave in San Francisco, to reconnect with families through uncensored mail, to sleep without the constant fear of attack. For Wilson, however, it brought a different reality. Even as the white sailors eagerly disembarked for liberty in the city, he and the ship's few black crew members were reminded of the limitations that awaited them ashore. "Best stick to the Fillmore district," advised Steward's mate First Class Joseph Brown, one of the ship's black sailors. "Rest of the city can get mighty unfriendly after dark." Wilson nodded, familiar with the geography of segregation that existed in every American city, even those as ostensibly progressive as San Francisco. "Not much different than New York," he observed. "Just with hills." Lieutenant Commander James Reynolds, the ship's executive officer, did attempt to submit Wilson's name for a Navy Cross. The recommendation was quietly declined by higher authority, with a suggestion that a letter of commendation would be more appropriate for a black Marine. Even that lesser recognition was eventually lost in the bureaucratic shuffle as the Kid underwent extensive repairs. Wilson himself was reassigned back to his original ammunition company, his brief service as a sniper aboard a destroyer becoming merely an unrecorded footnote in the larger narrative of the Pacific War. But for the survivors of the Kid, the memory of what they had witnessed would not fade so easily. "I don't care if he was purple with green spots," boatswain's mate First Class William Carlson would recall, decades later in an oral history interview. "That Marine saved our ship when he manned that 40mm alone. Without him, we'd have taken 2 or 3 more hits for sure, and we'd have gone down with all hands." The brass might not have wanted to admit a black man could do something like that, but everyone who was there knows the truth. Wilson's return to the 7th Ammunition Company marked a jarring transition. From the intimate confines of the destroyer, where his actions had earned him a measure of acceptance despite his race, he found himself once again in the rigidly segregated structure of the Marine Corps shore establishment. The ammunition company was now stationed at a supply depot near San Francisco, preparing for what many expected would be the eventual invasion of Japan. The work was routine and unglamorous, unloading ships, organizing ammunition stocks, conducting inventories. After the intensity of combat aboard the Kid, it felt trivial, disconnected from the war's reality. Yet Wilson found that he had changed, even if the world around him had not. The experience of combat, real combat, not the incidental exposure to danger that came with being an ammunition handler, had altered his perspective. He carried himself differently, spoke more confidently, and refused to accept the casual indignities that many of his fellow black Marines had learned to endure. "You're going to get yourself in trouble, Marcus," warned his friend Corporal James Hamilton, observing Wilson's increasingly assertive demeanor. "They don't like it when we forget our place." "My place is as a Marine," Wilson replied simply. "Prove that on the Kid, not going back to pretending otherwise." This new attitude earned him both respect and hostility. Some of the white officers who had combat experience themselves recognized the change in him and accorded him a measure of professional courtesy. Others, particularly those who had spent the war safely behind desks, found his confidence threatening and looked for opportunities to remind him of the racial hierarchy. In June 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa was drawing to its bloody conclusion, Wilson received an unexpected visitor at the ammunition depot. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sullivan, the damage control officer from the USS Kidd, had traced him through military channels. "Wasn't easy finding you," Sullivan said as they sat in the Spartan day room of Wilson's barracks. "Seems like they buried you pretty deep after the Kidd," Wilson shrugged. "Back where they think I belong." Sullivan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I've been talking to some people. There's a program starting up, very quiet, very small, looking at integration in specialist units, combat engineers, demolition teams, reconnaissance. They need men with proven combat experience." He paused. "I put your name forward." Wilson studied him skeptically. "Why?" "Because I saw what you did on the Kid. Because I'm tired of watching talent wasted because of stupid prejudice." Sullivan held his gaze steadily. "And because my brother was killed at Anzio, and I've seen enough death in this war. We need our best people where they can do the most good, regardless of what they look like." 2 weeks later, Wilson was transferred to a special training facility near San Diego. The unit was experimental and unofficial, a joint Navy-Marine Corps initiative exploring the effectiveness of mixed-race combat teams in specialized roles. It was small, comprising just 24 men, 12 white and 12 black, all with significant combat experience. The program's existence was a reflection of the contradictions in American military policy as the war entered its final phases. While the armed forces remained officially segregated, pragmatic commanders had begun to recognize that this policy often wasted valuable talent and hampered combat effectiveness. Small, unofficial experiments in integration were being conducted in various theaters, though they remained exceptions rather than the rule. For Wilson, the assignment represented both an opportunity and a vindication. For the first time since enlisting, he was being evaluated solely on his abilities rather than his race. The training was intense, focusing on advanced marksmanship, demolition techniques, and small unit tactics. The white and black team members initially maintained their distance from each other, but the rigors of training gradually forged bonds that transcended racial divisions. "Never thought I'd be taking orders from a colored fella," remarked Sergeant Frank Miller, a veteran of Tarawa and Saipan, after Wilson successfully led their squad through a night infiltration exercise. "But you know your stuff. Guess bullets don't care what color you are." "Neither do the men getting shot at," Wilson replied. "We all bleed the same." As July turned to August, the experimental unit prepared for deployment to the Western Pacific. Their mission would be to conduct reconnaissance and direct precision airstrikes in advance of the planned invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1, 1945. It promised to be exceptionally dangerous work, with little chance of rescue if things went wrong. Then, on August 6th, everything changed. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima, followed by Nagasaki on August 9th and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, altered the strategic landscape completely. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender, though the formal ceremony would not take place until September 2nd. For Wilson and his comrades, the war's sudden end brought conflicting emotions. Relief, certainly. The invasion of Japan had been expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. But also uncertainty about what would follow, particularly for the black service members who had fought for a freedom abroad that they had never fully experienced at home. "What happens to us now?" asked Private First Class Robert Taylor, one of the black Marines in the experimental unit, as they listened to news of the surrender on the radio. "We still going to deploy?" "Doubt it," Wilson replied. "War is over. No more need for experiments." He was right. Within a week, orders came through dissolving the special unit. The white personnel were reassigned to regular Marine combat units, while the black members were returned to service and support roles. The brief experiment in integration was abandoned as quickly as it had begun, a casualty of the sudden peace. Wilson found himself back in the 7th Ammunition Company, now tasked with the mundane work of inventorying and securing vast stockpiles of no longer needed ordnance. After the intensity of combat and the promise of the experimental unit, it was a dispiriting return to the status quo. Yet even as the military retreated from its wartime experimentation with integration, the experiences of men like Wilson had planted seeds that would eventually bear fruit. The shared dangers and hardships of combat had created bonds across racial lines that could not be easily forgotten. White servicemen who had fought alongside black comrades often found it difficult to return to pre-war patterns of segregation and discrimination. The USS Kidd, after extensive repairs, returned to Pearl Harbor in August 1945, just as the war was ending. She would never again see combat in World War II. After serving in the Korean War and undergoing several refits, she was decommissioned in 1964 and eventually became a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, one of the few surviving examples of a Fletcher-class destroyer preserved in its World War II configuration. For Marcus Wilson, the war's end brought both opportunity and continued struggle. Discharged from the Marines in November 1945, he returned to New York with combat experience, technical skills, and a Bronze Star Medal, but found that many of the same barriers remained. Despite the GI Bill, many universities maintained quotas limiting black enrollment. Jobs that utilized his military training often remained closed to him because of his race. He eventually found work as a machinist in a tool factory, married his high school sweetheart Marie Johnson in 1947, and raised 3 children in Queens, New York. His son, Marcus Wilson, Jr., would serve as a Marine Corps officer in Vietnam, benefiting from the integration of the armed forces ordered by President Truman in 1948, a change that came too late for the elder Wilson's career. Throughout the post-war decades, Wilson rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, particularly his time aboard the USS Kidd. Like many combat veterans, he preferred to focus on building a future rather than revisiting the past. But he maintained contact with a few of the men he had served with, including Lieutenant Sullivan, who had gone on to a successful career as a naval engineer. In 1968, Wilson attended his first reunion of Kidd survivors, held in Chicago. He was the only black veteran present, and his arrival caused a momentary awkwardness. Then gunner's mate Caldwell, now a middle-aged construction foreman with a receding hairline, spotted him across the hotel lobby. "Wilson!" he shouted, rushing forward to embrace him. "The man who saved our bacon! Boys, this is the Marine I told you about. Best damn shot in the whole Pacific." The ice broken, Wilson found himself surrounded by men eager to shake his hand, to reminisce about their shared ordeal, to introduce him to wives and grown children. For many of the white veterans, it was their first opportunity to properly acknowledge what he had done that April day in 1945. "They never gave you the medal you deserved," Commander Moore, now retired and walking with a cane, told him quietly during the dinner. "I want you to know I tried. We all did." Wilson nodded, touched by the gesture, but long past any expectation of official recognition. "It wasn't about medals," he said simply. "It was about bringing as many of us home as possible." It wasn't until 1994, nearly 50 years after the Kamikaze attack on the USS Kidd, that Wilson's actions received formal recognition. During a reunion of Kidd survivors in Baton Rouge, several former crew members publicly recounted his role in defending the ship. A local newspaper article caught the attention of a Navy historian who began researching the incident. In a ceremony at the Pentagon on April 11, 1995, exactly 50 years after the attack, 74-year-old Marcus Wilson was awarded the Silver Star for his actions, with the citation specifically acknowledging his extraordinary heroism in manning an unattended 40mm anti-aircraft gun alone, successfully defending USS Kidd against multiple enemy aircraft after the ship had already sustained severe damage from a kamikaze hit. Wilson, his hair now gray, but his bearing still straight and proud, accepted the medal with characteristic humility. Subsequent investigation uncovered Lieutenant Commander Reynolds's original Navy Cross recommendation in archived records, along with personal diaries and letters from crew members that corroborated the account. "I was just doing what needed doing," he told the assembled dignitaries. Yes, same as any Marine would have done in that situation. He passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months later, having finally received a measure of the recognition that had been denied him half a century earlier. The story of Marcus Wilson and the USS Kidd represents more than just an individual act of heroism. It illuminates a larger truth about the segregated military of World War II, that in the crucible of combat, the artificial barriers of race often dissolved in the face of shared danger and common purpose. Black Americans served with distinction throughout the conflict, often in supporting roles that placed them in harm's way, despite official policies limiting them to non-combat assignments. In the Pacific Theater alone, approximately 17,000 African Americans served in the Marine Corps, primarily in ammunition and depot companies. Their contributions, frequently overlooked in popular histories of the war, were nevertheless essential to the American victory. Black Marines fought and died on islands from Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, displaying the same courage and commitment as their white counterparts. The USS Kidd itself stands today as a National Historic Landmark in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, one of the few Fletcher-class destroyers preserved in its World War II configuration. Visitors can walk her decks, explore her compartments, and gain a visceral understanding of the conditions under which her crew fought and sometimes died. A small plaque, added in 1996, acknowledges the contribution of Marcus Wilson and other black service members who served aboard her during the war. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of Wilson's story is how it challenges conventional narratives about race, heroism, and recognition in American military history. His actions aboard the Kidd demonstrated that courage and capability transcend racial categories, a truth that would gradually, painfully reshape American institutions in the decades that followed. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. It would take years for this order to be fully implemented, particularly in the Marine Corps, which had been the last service to accept black recruits and remained the most resistant to integration. Not until the Korean War would black and white Marines routinely serve together in the same units. For men like Marcus Wilson, who had proven their worth in combat only to return to segregation and discrimination, the change came too late to benefit their own careers. But their service and sacrifice helped pave the way for future generations. The first black Marine officer, Frederick C. Branch, was commissioned in November 1945, just as Wilson was being discharged. By the Vietnam era, black officers and senior non-commissioned officers were no longer rarities in the Corps. Today, the Marine Corps, like all U.S. military branches, reflects the diversity of the nation it serves, with African Americans serving at all ranks and in all specialties. In 2012, the Marine Corps formally recognized the contribution of the Montford Point Marines, the approximately 20,000 black Marines who trained at the segregated facility between 1942 and 1949. Congress awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, acknowledging their service and the discrimination they faced. The story of Marcus Wilson and the USS Kidd reminds us that history is often more complex, more nuanced than official records suggest. It compels us to look beyond the authorized narratives to find the hidden stories of courage and contribution that might otherwise be lost to time. It challenges us to recognize that heroism knows no color line, that in the most desperate moments, what matters is not the race of the person beside you, but whether they have the courage and skill to do what needs doing. Would you have had the courage to man that 40-millimeter gun alone with enemy aircraft bearing down and your ship already badly damaged? Would you have continued to serve with honor, knowing that your contribution might go unrecognized for decades because of the color of your skin? These are the questions that Marcus Wilson's story poses to each of us. Questions about courage, about justice, about what truly defines heroism in the face of both external enemies and internal prejudice. As the USS Kidd continues to stand watch over the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, she serves as a silent witness to these truths. Her scars, still visible in her restored hull, speak to the violence of war, but they also testify to the courage of those who served aboard her, men of all races who faced death together, and in doing so, began the long process of forging a more perfect union. Share this story so others will remember what true courage looks like, regardless of the uniform it wears or the skin it lives in. For in remembering Marcus Wilson and the men of the USS Kidd, we honor not just their specific acts of heroism, but the larger truth they embodied, that when faced with a common threat, Americans have always found the strength to stand together, even when their nation's laws and customs would keep them apart.